And at this part, we're going to go ahead and begin our keynote discussion Q&A. We have Uplift admin Daniela Murra Prey with us tonight, facilitating our Q&A near the beautiful vistas of the ruins of Tula in Hidalgo, Mexico. Hey, Daniela, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Roseanne.
Well, take it
Well,
away.
yeah, so before we get started, I'm just going to do a quick intro for our first speaker this evening, who will be Fiona Givens. Fiona Givens is a writer, teacher, and speaker who focuses on matters of history, theology, and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She was born in Nairobi, and she was educated in British convent schools. She converted to the LDS Church when she was a young adult, and she has several degrees, some focusing in French, German, and European history. Most of the people that are in our groups will be most familiar with her works, that she co-wrote with her husband, and she wrote things like The Crucible of Doubt, which is a book that focuses on the reflections for faith. She also wrote The God Who Weeps with her husband, and also another book that was published within the last couple of years called The Christ Who Heals, How God Restored the Truth That Saves Us. This was an excellent book that I definitely enjoyed a lot. I've read everything that Fiona has done, particularly her work that has been published in many venues. She's also done some work on Heavenly Mother, which was very inspiring for me. And here she is. Hi, Fiona.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So before we get started, we're going to start each of our interviews this evening with 2 questions, just to get to know the speakers a little bit, and then we'll open it up to the Facebook Live so that people can ask questions there, and we'll convey it over here. So the first question is, did you ever arrive at a fork in your faith where one choice would have led you away from the restored gospel, and the other choice would have led you towards the restored gospel? And what did you do, and how did you navigate making that choice?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I would say, would it have? Well, my issue with the teachings of the church, my main issue, and I understand that this is mine, is polygamy. And so when I had to wrestle with that, because I could not find any support for the practice in scriptural texts. And the impact seemed to be the same, whether or not one was in a culture that practiced polygamy or not. So that was very stressful for me, because for a number of reasons, but particularly that I could not see the practice countenanced in scriptural texts. I think that the Book of Mormon is an inherently anti-polygamous text. Nowhere is there any suggestion that it should be practiced, even when we have a tiny colony coming. The scribe goes out of his way to mention, or to make sure that everybody understands that one wife was bought for each of the brothers. So how I navigated that, it was difficult because I was in it for a while. It's very painful, as all of these crises are extremely painful. But it was actually the gospel restored by Joseph Smith, the magnanimity of his mind, his expansive heart. And it was primarily my research into the Christ Who Heals, looking at the early church fathers and actually reading them and delving into their works. I recognized an incredible similarity between what they were saying and writing and what Joseph was proclaiming. I have no problem with fallible men or fallible prophets. So for me, I worked the situation into, I think Joseph is a fallible prophet. I personally don't think that polygamy was a revelation. On the other hand, I can say with great zeal that Joseph was channeling revelatory power. Absolutely. And so I was able to work the two, the fallible prophet and the fact that he was a prophet of God, into symmetry in my mind.
That's wonderful. Thank you. For those of you unfamiliar with her book, the book is split into two sections. The first section focuses actually on some of these Eastern religion fathers and talks about their beliefs, the way that the restored gospel ties into that. And then the second half is beautifully a devotional, I would say, love letter for the Savior, that it touched me. And I've read it actually 2 times and share it with people quite often, because I was so shocked the first time that I read it, the way that it allowed me to connect with the Savior. So thank you for sharing that. A lot of women, a lot of men struggle with polygamy as well. I think it's something that continues to be a huge problem for people today. And I think in my experience with Faith Crisis, some people believe for various reasons that it was inspired and some people don't. And I think that being such a large religion and not focusing on it anymore, we should allow space for people to feel both ways about the matter, especially because we are very removed from it at this point, entering into just completing our 2nd century of being a church. So very exciting. Thank you.
But what you said, Danielle, I think is also really important, creating space. And I think that's something that we could do better, creating space for different atonement theories, different beliefs within our tradition, to expand it, to include other belief systems, I think might be helpful, not to be frightened of being attacked or, being confronted by different belief systems.
Absolutely. There's actually a quote in one of the papers that your husband wrote about the restoration from, I believe from Joseph Smith, where he talks about how we should be drawing truth from everywhere, from Methodism and from Protestantism. And
in fact, he said we would not come out pure Mormons if we did not draw in all of the beauty from other faith traditions, and secular traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we approach in modern religion is the necessity to incorporate more about science and more about things that are relevant to today, because we can't continue to hold a faith tradition if we only focus on the mystic part of it. We also have to include it in how it relates to things that are relevant today. And one of those things is Gnosticism, also intellectualism. And I think that those things are actually welcome in faith in certain ways. So thank you. Now, the second question we'll be asking is, in your experience, what is one effective way to strengthen relationships between people who have different beliefs? This could include family members or friends that we have that have either left the church or practice another faith tradition.
I think probably the most important thing is to have respect. When people leave our faith tradition, this particularly happens in families, parents generally become very frightened. They're fearful, and unfortunately, fear is not an incentive for good behavior. We tend to act badly when we are frightened. And I think the driving force for most parents is the fact that they are no longer, or they will not be, an eternal family. So we've sort of created our own form of hell. And that is, we're raised, at least my children were raised, singing that we will be a family forever. And then when they leave the faith, there is this fear that we are no longer, that unity, that eternal unity has been cut. And that is very frightening. So to get over that fear and, acknowledge, go back to Joseph. I mean, go back to that, it doesn't matter, really what faith they are espousing, or if they're espousing any faith at all. There's family ties are of the utmost importance. So it may be, as for some of my friends, it may be very traumatic to come back to church, because church creates trauma or adds to the trauma or revisits trauma. But in the family or friendship sense, we can do things that will not, give that proclivity towards re-experiencing the trauma. So my family loved to bike together, and one of my family members, that's what he loves to do with his children, is go out biking. That was a good experience, a good family experience for him. So revisiting those really positive family experiences and reenacting them, doing them again, creates a wider safe space for us to inhabit. And for those who don't belong to our religious tradition, again, it's really important to respect. It's really important to remember that we are all God's children, and that God has the same desire for their children as we do for ours. And it is an expansive world, an expansive, very diverse family. But that is really important. And for me, I'm reading in Doctrine and Covenants 10. It's really funny because we all switch off, don't we, when we're reading the long chapters and we come to about verse 53 and our brains go into sleep mode. Well, that's when we should wake up, actually. I've noticed that that's the longer sections, it's towards the end that all the exciting stuff happens. And in D&C 10, which was given in 1829, so a year before the church was initiated, God is talking about, or the Savior is talking about unfortunate things that have been lost. But then he turns his attention to another group of people, and he addresses them as my church, and he comforts them. He says, don't be frightened of the new church on the block. I have not come to destroy, but you have received. And he repeats that. I've not come to destroy. And then he speaks to them as being members of his church. And so I'm thinking of this as a global church, what Jakob Boehmer called the church without walls. And I think if we can see ourselves as just a very wide and diverse church family who will eventually be reunited with the divine family, that creates a space for love as well as respect, I think. I can't hear you, Daniela.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened, but I got locked out for a moment. Thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with that. And I also think it's powerful to note that you come from a mixed faith family yourself, correct? Because you
Right.
Converted and your family's Catholic, correct?
Yes, actually, you're right. It was mixed faith. My mother was Catholic and my father was Anglican.
Oh, wow. What a wonderful mixture. That must have been very
well, it was interesting because I did the same thing. I think many children do in our mixed faith families. When my father would tuck me in at night, I'd always ask him, will you become a Catholic, Daddy? Will you convert to Catholicism so that we can be together as a family in heaven? So, that was there in my mind, wanting Daddy to become Catholic so that we can be a family. So I understand, children of mixed families doing the same thing, worrying
Yes.
that they will not be together. So asking their parent or their sibling to convert.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and my mom was raised by two people who were originally LDS, but actually was baptized later because they weren't active and they started to attend other faith traditions. And she often spoke to me about the same things when I was younger, and it was a really powerful experience for me to hear about other religions from a young age. I think sometimes people that grow up in a very strong LDS tradition don't always have that experience, and so they interpret things a little bit differently from people who have exposure to other religions. So I think that mixed faith families should recognize that there are challenges, but also that there are wonderful things that come out of it, because you get such a wide perspective and such an appreciation and a respect for many different types of people, and that's powerful for me. So thank you. Now, we have another question right here from one of our speakers in the live group, and you mentioned that while you were writing for the Christ Who Heals, you started to really develop a testimony of Joseph Smith and his prophetic mantle. Can you describe maybe one or two things that you felt really touched you or showed you that he was a prophet, or that maybe the Spirit testified to you in that moment that was his role?
Well, I think what comes to me immediately is this idea that mortality is an educational experience. It's actually an ascent, not a fall. But I see that in Irenaeus, where he says, how can you become a god if you have not first been made man? So it's that idea there. I mean, the creation is still there, but the idea that mortality is educational was definitely an idea of Joseph's. His universalism too, with Origen, we see it very clearly, and of course he was anathematized for that, and unfortunately most of his work destroyed as a result. But in fact, that idea of universalism is so tenacious that, you know, it sort of has to be true. It keeps popping up no matter how much one wants to get rid of it. And again, that was Joseph's teaching, the idea that the whole human family could be sealed and that we could collaborate in the divine enterprise through the work we do in our temples. And I'm going on. I need to be quiet. I don't respect full stops. So I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, that's fantastic. One of the things that you said that really stuck out to me was the idea of how universalism keeps popping up. This time, as I've been reading the Book of Mormon, I've been following along with the Maxwell Institute's theological introductions. And obviously, your husband wrote the book for 2nd Nephi. And as obviously it was just released and they haven't been sent out yet, but as I was listening to his podcast, kind of describing it, something started to change in the way I viewed the Book of Mormon, where I recognize that we keep starting out with small groups of people. We have a small group of covenant people, and then it keeps getting expanded. And it's almost like a divine work every single time. It's like God has to tell people that everybody deserves the gospel. Everybody deserves the love of his son. And that's a really powerful message for me. For me, it's been transformational in the way that I view scripture and the way that I'm viewing what I'm reading, because again, we have a small group of people and their goal is to give it to everyone, to expand this house of Israel and to expand so that these brothers and those brothers will all receive the same type of gift. So thank you. That's a wonderful thought. Now, the next question we have is, do you have any specific advice for mixed faith families to be able to thrive? You mentioned talking about family activities that maybe are neutral, not necessarily related to religion or practicing a religion, but is there anything else that you would offer as advice to someone going through that with their marriage or their own family?
I think patience. This takes a long time, and to understand that the journey your spouse or your beloved is on is perfectly fine. If it's, I think in God's eyes, and I'm presuming to think like God, but I think, well, I've always been impressed by that scripture that the path is narrow that leads back to God, and I can't imagine us all on it. So I reimagine it as, you know, billions of paths, and they're all narrow because you and Christ are the only people on them. And I think if we see that, it, for me anyway, it downgrades the fear level that we will not have anything in common anymore, and that, you know, these deeply held beliefs of mine and that used to be ours, used to be cherished by both of us, are no longer there. That's all right. It's fine. We need to grant space. Space for the two new religious traditions, or the older religious tradition and the new one that is formulating or not in one's beloved mind. There is space for that, and in fact, I think it creates a bigger space for love to deepen.
I agree. Thank you. And that also is a really powerful thought. Going back to your comment about Joseph Smith, for the believing members of the family, I think that we should take great piece in the fact that Joseph Smith taught that it's about education and about experiencing things in the life. Sometimes disbelief or atheism or whatever else it is a necessary experience to be able to draw closer to Christ eventually. So thank you. Our next question has to do about women in the church. This one is about feeling empowered as a woman in a church that is still male-centric, but does have some feminist beliefs, particularly relating to Heavenly Mother and a female deity. What can we do in our church culture to help? First, this is the first part of the question, we'll start here. What can we do in our church culture to help make that more prominent in our wards and in our faith communities? And then we'll start with the second half after we finish that.
Well, let me see. I think we are making steps towards incorporating women into the ecclesiastical structure insofar as I think that the temple endowment changes have been really crucial and very important. But I think also there is, Elder Ballard has been circumnavigating the globe, I don't know, at least for a decade, probably longer, on the importance of councils. And so the fact that councils are there and that women are increasingly not feeling that they're just the female presence and shouldn't be contributing to the council, but are. So that we're shifting cultures here, and I think it's really important for us to understand that seismic shifts are generally terrifying and they don't work. So this gradual shifting from a culture of the woman being the man having authority over the wife. There is now more discussion of equality in marriage. So it's moving from that culture into the new culture, because there are a lot of women, older women, who are used to that culture and actually don't want to move. They don't want to have what they feel is a greater involvement in the church structure because they've had enough. So we have to wait or move with them, help them move with us into this new paradigm, which is terribly exciting.
Yes, for me, being a younger woman in the church, that's something that I've run into in my own Relief Society, the uncomfortable feelings when someone brings up Heavenly Mother. Or I was asked to give a talk in Relief Society last year on President Nelson's talk from the women's session, where he talked about women in the priesthood and priesthood authority, and everybody was very confused. And so there were a lot of women in that lesson that I could tell felt uncomfortable, that made comments to me afterwards, because their entire life, and I know that my mom has experienced this as well. She's discussed with me, it used to be women don't have the priesthood because they don't need it, because it would just be a burden and it's so hard for the men and all of these things. And then it started to shift more to, well, maybe you do have it, and now it's, yes, you do have it, but what do you do with it, and how do you access that power, and how do you take from the power of Christ and the power of the priesthood? And personally, it's been a confusing time, I think, for a lot of women. Yes.
It's so funny, Daniela, because my daughter Rachel taught the exact same lesson with the exact same response. In fact, she felt most of the Relief Societies in the lesson were, saying, well, this is, and she said, Mom, I am quoting President Nelson. And
yes, the prophet.
they are all really mad and,
yes.
And angry and discombobulated. So you're absolutely right. It does tend to do that. For me, I love precedence. I think precedence has a very strong rule. So when I think of this, my vision for Relief Society is, going back to the Nauvoo Relief Society. And we have precedents for, and we also have a structure actually for a collaborative ecclesiastical framework that other male-dominated religions such as Catholicism doesn't have. And this idea of a parity on all of the levels, on the first presidency level, first presidency with the Relief Society. It was actually Maxine Hanks who, set this out for me. And it's absolutely beautiful because you have collaboration in every step of the church, from all the way from the first presidency down to the young women's president, the young men's president. So I feel that that the ecclesiastical structure is built for collaborative enterprises, and I hope we're going back in that direction, because that was definitely the case in the early church, as I see. And then this whole idea with the key, we're shifting from a tradition of Joseph turned the key in Emma's behalf to Joseph giving Emma the key. And in Joseph's paradigm, keys were synonymous with priesthood. That is how he viewed keys. So it's very exciting. We're living in an extremely exciting time, I have to say, watching the shifts in the church, and promising.
Yes, I agree. And with President Nelson's challenge for the women to read some of these sections, particularly the one addressed to Emma, anyone who talked to me about it, I also sent them over to the first 50 years of the Relief Society, so they could go through and read the compilation of the beginning of Better Days, because when Joseph gave that key to Emma for her to use with her priesthood authority, and ironically in section 25 it also talks about ordaining Emma and all of these things. It's very exciting language. Yeah. He talks for a moment about the beginning of better days, and that for me breathes new life into the Relief Society, which has not always been a comfortable experience or a comfortable transition for me as I transitioned into adulthood. So thank you for those thoughts. Now, the final part of that question is how we connect with the feminine divine. I believe it was last year that you gave a presentation on just a compilation of works of Heavenly Mother. As you did this, did you feel the presence more of Heavenly Mother in your work? Do you have advice for someone looking to connect with the feminine divine, I guess?
Well, I feel, and I think here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton stands as a prophet among women, because she recognized the awkwardness of the way the Trinity was composed, all male and not a single female. And for her, just looking at it, she said, well, this is ridiculous. If you have a father and a son, there has to be a mother. So that was very exciting. What I am involved in right now is looking for Heavenly Mother in the Christian texts, so in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that has been really exciting for me, because once you recognize that she is there, and if we do believe in a Heavenly Mother, then she has to be there, then she becomes much more apparent. So I see her all over the text, and does that make me feel good? Yes, that makes me feel really, really good. She has different names, but the methods of worshiping her don't change, from Abraham all the way to to the end. King Josiah and the Deuteronomists did their best to excise her from the scriptures, but fortunately for us, they weren't entirely successful. And it's in those small spaces that when you add them all together, then you have this marvelous illuminating whole. And for me, that's terribly exciting. So if I can find her in the scriptural text, then that gives me more confidence that she is there, that she has always been there, and that she is as involved in our lives equally with the Father and the Son.
Thank you. I agree with that as well. I saw someone the other day make a comment in one of the things that I had been doing a forum about the more progressive, I guess, parts of women in the church. And she said that before, people used to bring up the scriptures and they would think, I don't know, I don't see Heavenly Mother here, all the pronouns are male, what do I do with this? And now they've been educated to the point where they can start to actually turn to the scriptures to look for the feminine divine there and use that as evidence and use that as a basis for their testimony and for their belief here. So thank you so much for your thoughts today, Fiona. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. We appreciate you coming here for Uplift, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you again.
Yeah, so very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right.